Donald Trump just signed an executive order that may redirect an extraordinary amount of capital into a sector most investors are still treating as background noise. Most people are watching NVIDIA. Most people are watching the chip makers. Most people are watching the visible part of the artificial intelligence. Boom, because that is where the headlines are. But when I look at a system, I do not only look at the headline, I look at the second order and third order consequences. I ask what must be true for the first thing to keep happening. I ask what bottleneck appears when the popular story gets too large for the existing system. And in this case, the bottleneck is not the model. It is not the software. It is not even the chip. It is power. There is a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure problem unfolding inside the United States right now, and it sits underneath almost every artificial intelligence story people are buying. America's power grid is being forced to carry a load it was not designed to carry. It was built for a different economy, a different technology cycle, and a different level of electricity demand. Now, artificial intelligence data centers are arriving like a new industrial species. They do not sleep. They do not slow down at night. They do not run only when the sun is shining. They require continuous power, stable power, redundant power, and they require it at a scale that is very difficult for most people to visualize. The important question is not whether AI is real. The important question is whether the physical system underneath AI can survive the demand that AI is creating. When I look at that problem, I see an investment principle I have used for most of my life. Follow the flow of money. Do not follow the noise. Do not follow the argument. Do not follow the story that is already comfortable to repeat. Follow where capital is being forced to go because the system has no other choice. Right now, capital is being forced into power generation, grid reliability, transmission lines, transformers, substations, cooling systems, electrical components, uranium, aluminum, copper, gas infrastructure, and the companies that physically build and maintain the energy backbone of the economy. That is the real story. The executive order matters because it gives a political and regulatory push to a process that was already happening. It is called strengthening the United States grid reliability and security. And while the name sounds bureaucratic, the consequences are not small. The government is effectively saying that grid failure is now a strategic risk. It is saying that power supply is not just an energy issue, it is a national security issue, a military issue, an industrial issue, and increasingly an AI issue. When a government begins to define a bottleneck as a national security problem, capital does not move slowly, it moves with force. This is why the average investor is late to understand what has been happening. They look at the stock market and say the S&P 500 has not done much. They look at the index and feel frustrated. They assume nothing important is happening because the broad market is not giving them a clear signal. But markets are not one thing. Markets are flows. Money moves from one pocket of the system to another. Sometimes the index looks sleepy while a handful of sectors are quietly receiving institutional capital. Sometimes the headline says the market is flat while power construction companies, engineering contractors, electrical component makers, fuel cell providers, nuclear companies, and grid infrastructure businesses are moving very differently. That is why the principle matters. Do not ask only whether the market is going up, ask where the money is going. Wall Street understood this months before most retail investors did. While the public was still arguing about AI chips, institutional money was already rotating into companies that make AI physically possible. Power line construction companies moved far more than the index. Engineering and construction names moved far more than the index. Electronic component companies moved far more than the index. Some individual names connected to grid power, power conversion, fuel cells, or cooling moved by extraordinary percentages while the broad market barely moved. That is not an accident. It is a signal. It tells you that the system is beginning to reprice the physical layer underneath the digital economy. I want you to think about the electric grid like the circulatory system of a body. The artificial intelligence companies are the brain demanding more oxygen. The chips are the neurons firing faster. The data centers are organs expanding their capacity, but if the circulatory system cannot deliver enough blood, the whole organism becomes stressed. It does not matter how advanced the brain is if the body cannot supply it. That is what is happening to the American power grid. AI data centers already require an amount of power comparable to tens of millions of American homes. By the end of the decade, that demand can more than double at the same time. A large portion of the nation's transformers are old. Many of them were built for a world of refrigerators, factories, office towers, air conditioners, and ordinary household demand. They were not built for massive data centers running power-hungry AI systems day and night. When the power demand curve changes faster than infrastructure can adjust, the system has a problem. And when the system has a problem that threatens military installations, data centers, industrial supply chains, and national competitiveness, the government steps in. That is what makes this moment different. For many years, investors treated the grid as a slow, boring utility issue. Utility assets were associated with dividends, regulation, and modest growth. But this is not just a utility story anymore. It is an infrastructure acceleration story. It is an AI capacity story. It is an energy security story. It is also a capital allocation story. The government can now use emergency powers to prevent grid failures. It can keep certain power plants running even if they were scheduled to close. It can encourage or facilitate long-term power purchase agreements for military and critical facilities. It can push money into transmission upgrades. It can make capacity more valuable because the grid cannot afford to lose it. That changes incentives. And when incentives change, money moves. A lot of people want a simple stock tip. They want somebody to say, buy this and sell that. That is not how I think. A stock without a framework is just a story. And stories are dangerous when they are not connected to reality. The better approach is to understand the causal chain. AI creates enormous electricity demand. The existing grid cannot handle all of that demand quickly enough. Data centers need power now, not in 10 years. The government wants reliability, security, and domestic capacity. Utilities, contractors, fuel cell companies, nuclear companies, component makers, and raw material suppliers become more strategically important. Capital flows into the companies that can solve the bottleneck. That is the chain. Once you understand the chain, you can then look for evidence, not opinions. Evidence, one of the most important pieces of evidence, is backlog. Backlog is work a company has already sold but has not yet fully delivered. It is not a dream. It is not a press release about what management hopes might happen. It is signed work. It is future revenue that already has a contractual foundation. When you see backlogs expanding in a sector tied to a massive macro bottleneck, you should pay attention. A backlog is a bridge between the story and the financial statements. It tells you whether demand is turning into actual business. Take a company like Quanta Services. It is one of the major grid infrastructure contractors in North America. It builds transmission lines, substations, and the high-voltage infrastructure needed to move electricity across the system. When a company like that has a backlog measured in the tens of billions of dollars, that matters. It says the work is not theoretical, it is already being booked. That does not mean the stock is automatically cheap. It does not mean it will go up in a straight line. It does not mean you ignore valuation, risk, execution, or position sizing. But it means the demand is real. That is how a serious investor should think, not in slogans. In evidence, the first major area I would pay attention to is off-grid power generation. This is one of the most important changes in the system in the old model. A data center would connect to the grid and draw power like everyone else. In the new model, the grid connection can take years. Permits take time, transmission upgrades take time, substations take time. Utilities do not move at the speed of artificial intelligence. But the AI race is not waiting. If you are one of the large technology companies and the demand for computing capacity is rising now, waiting 5 or 10 years for a grid connection can mean losing the strategic race. So the data center operators begin to do something extraordinary. They build or contract for their own power. They become, in effect, their own mini utilities. That is a structural change. It means private companies are no longer only consumers of electricity. They are becoming planners, financiers, and buyers of dedicated generation capacity. Fuel cells fit into this because they can generate electricity on site. Bloom Energy is one of the names connected to that theme. Its systems can sit near a data center and provide power without requiring the same kind of traditional grid dependence. The idea is not complicated. If the grid cannot deliver enough reliable power quickly, then power moves closer to the point of use. That is an important principle. The more valuable electricity becomes to AI operations, the more valuable reliable on-site power becomes. The second part of that off-grid story is nuclear power, especially small modular nuclear concepts and companies tied to that direction. Oklo is one of the names being watched because small nuclear reactors could, in principle, provide clean, continuous power near high-demand sites. This is why nuclear has returned to the conversation. Not because everybody suddenly changed their ideology, but because the system needs baseload power. Solar and wind have roles. But they are intermittent. They depend on weather, time of day, storage, and transmission. Data centers do not have the luxury of intermittent power. They need electricity all the time. That is why gas and nuclear remain important in the transition. The system can prefer clean energy politically, but the system also needs reliability mechanically. In the end, physics always has more power than slogans. If nuclear becomes more important, then uranium becomes more important. Camco is one of the large uranium suppliers, and uranium supply is not something that can be expanded overnight. For years, the world underinvested in nuclear capacity and related supply chains. Now, if demand returns at the same time that supply is tight, the economics can change quickly. Again, the point is not to fall in love with a ticker. The point is to understand the bottleneck. A reactor needs fuel, a data center needs continuous power, a government worried about grid reliability needs capacity. When those forces line up, capital begins to flow. The next major area is the physical grid builders. These are the companies that do the heavy work nobody puts on the cover of magazines. They build transmission lines, they upgrade substations, they install and maintain electrical infrastructure, they build power plants, they build pipelines where gas-fired generation is part of the solution. They do the difficult, physical, regulated, capital-intensive work that makes the glamorous digital economy possible. This is where companies like Quanta Services, Mastech, Argon, and Comfort Systems become interesting as categories. Quanta is tied to transmission and grid infrastructure. Mastech is tied to pipelines and power lines. Argon is tied to power plant construction. Comfort Systems is tied to mechanical and electrical contracting, including the kinds of cooling and electrical work that data centers require. The precise performance of any stock will depend on many things: valuation, contract execution, margins, labor costs, interest rates, and investor expectations. But the structural demand is clear. If the grid must be rebuilt, if data centers must be powered, if transmission lines must be upgraded, and if power capacity must expand, then the companies doing the work become essential. In my way of thinking, this is similar to owning the pick and shovel providers during a gold rush. The people searching for gold may or may not find it, but the people who sell the tools, build the roads, provide the water, and maintain the camp often make money because the entire system needs their services. AI is the gold rush, the grid is the camp, power infrastructure is the pick and shovel, and that is where many investors are still not looking. The third major area is the component layer. If the grid is the pick and shovel play of AI, then electrical components are the pick and shovel play of the grid. Every data center, every substation, every power line, every power plant, every cooling system, every transformer upgrade requires specialized components. This is not a low barrier. Commodity software product where a new competitor can appear in a month. These are industrial components, engineered products, and mission critical systems. You need power modules, you need switchgear, you need circuit boards, you need electrical distribution equipment, you need thermal management, you need cooling systems, you need transformers, you need connection hardware, you need power conversion. Companies like Viker Powell Industries, Vertiv, TTM Technologies, and Advanced Energy Industries sit in different parts of that component ecosystem. Viker is tied to power conversion. Powell Industries is tied to switchgear and electrical distribution. Vertiv is tied to thermal management and cooling systems. TTM and Advanced Energy sit in areas connected to electronics, power systems, and specialized industrial demand. These are not always companies that retail investors naturally understand. They do not have the same glamour as a consumer-facing technology brand. But in many cycles, the less glamorous layer can have the more durable demand because it is where the bottleneck sits. AI chips produce heat. Heat requires cooling. AI data centers require power. Power requires conversion, distribution, protection, and control. The grid requires equipment. Equipment requires materials. That leads to the next layer, raw materials. You cannot rebuild a power grid with slogans. You need aluminum for transmission conductors. You need copper for wiring, transformers, motors, and electrical systems. You need uranium if nuclear capacity grows. You need steel, cement, land engineering, labor, and permits. The raw material story is easy to oversimplify, so I would be careful. Commodity companies are cyclical. They can run very hard and fall very hard. But when the world suddenly needs more infrastructure at the same time, governments are prioritizing domestic supply chains and tariffs are changing incentives, the material producers can become part of the chain. Aluminum is particularly relevant for transmission. Companies tied to domestic aluminum production, such as Century Aluminum or Alcoa, can become part of the discussion when infrastructure spending, tariffs, and domestic sourcing line up. But here again, I would not think like a gambler. A strong theme does not justify a careless price. It gives you a watch list, a map, and a reason to study. That is different from a blind purchase. One mistake many investors make is believing they must be first. They think the only way to win is to buy before anyone else notices. That is not how the better operators think. Being too early can be as dangerous as being too late. If you buy before the money starts moving, you can sit for years in an idea that is intellectually correct, but financially dead. There is a better way: be early enough to benefit, but late enough that the evidence is real. That means waiting for money flow, contract momentum, backlog growth, price confirmation, and institutional attention to begin showing up. You do not need to guess in the dark. You can wait until the system begins to reveal its direction. This is a very important principle. The best investments are not always the ideas that sound the most clever. They are often the ideas where the data is public, but the public has not yet understood its significance. The executive order is public, the power demand numbers are public, the age of the grid is public, the backlogs are public, the contract announcements are public, the stock charts are public. The problem is not that ordinary investors are forbidden from seeing the information. The problem is that they are usually watching the wrong things. They are watching arguments instead of flows. They are watching headlines instead of backlogs. They are watching broad indexes instead of sector rotation. They are watching what is popular instead of what is becoming necessary. That is why a simple framework matters. Start by zooming out. Ask what trend is undeniable, not what might happen. Not what someone hopes will happen, not what a commentator is emotionally attached to, what is already happening at a scale too large to ignore. In this case, AI power demand is already happening. Data centers are already being built. The grid is already strained. Old equipment is already a problem. The government has already identified grid reliability as critical. Companies are already seeking off grid solutions. Backlogs are already rising in certain areas. That is the first part. Then ask who benefits. Do not fight the trend. Do not try to predict the exact ending. Do not reduce everything to one political opinion. Instead, identify the businesses that benefit if the trend continues. If AI needs power, who sells power? If the grid needs rebuilding, who builds it? If data centers need cooling, who supplies it? If nuclear returns, who supplies the fuel? If transmission expands, who supplies aluminum, copper, switchgear, transformers, and electrical components? That is the second part. Then look for confirmation, not fantasy. Confirmation, backlogs, contracts, revenue growth, margin resilience, institutional accumulation, relative strength versus the broader market, sector leadership, management commentary that matches actual numbers, balance sheets that can support expansion. That is the third part. This is how you move from a story to a process. Without a process, investors usually do one of two things. They either panic because the broad market looks uncertain, or they chase whatever has already become obvious. Both behaviors come from the same weakness. They are reactive. The goal is to become less reactive. I have spent a large part of my life studying how systems work because markets are systems, economies are systems, debt cycles are systems. Capital flows are systems, energy grids are systems. When you understand the system, you do not need to predict every event. You need to understand the pressures and the incentives. The pressure here is power demand. The incentive here is reliability, security, and industrial competitiveness. The bottleneck here is grid capacity. The money is flowing toward the bottleneck. That is what matters. Now, there are risks. There are always risks. Some of these stocks have already moved significantly. A stock that has gone up 100% can still go higher, but it can also correct sharply. A company with a strong backlog can still disappoint. If costs rise, projects delay, margins compress, or the market decides it paid too much for future growth. A government program can change, a contract can be delayed, a technology can disappoint, a commodity can reverse. So the lesson is not to throw discipline away because the theme is powerful. The lesson is to combine the theme with discipline. Position sizing matters, entry points matter, valuation matters, diversification matters. The ability to admit you are wrong matters. If the money leaves the sector, you should not pretend it is still there, just because the story still sounds good. One of the reasons many investors underperform is that they become loyal to narratives. They should be loyal to principles instead. A narrative says, this sector must win. A principle says, I will follow the evidence as long as the evidence remains strong. That distinction is everything. The grid and energy trade may continue to elevate because now it has multiple forces behind it. AI demand, aging infrastructure, government support, national security framing, data center urgency, and industrial reshoring. But if the flows rotate somewhere else, a disciplined investor notices and adapts. The goal is not to be emotionally correct. The goal is to be aligned with reality. This is why simply sitting in the index and complaining that nothing is happening can be so costly. The index can hide enormous internal movement. There are periods when the broad market is up a few percent, while certain sectors are up multiples of that because the money is rotating underneath the surface. Most people do not see that because they are not trained to look. They ask whether the market is good or bad. A better question is, where is the market rewarding real demand? In this moment, one answer is the AI power chain off-grid generation, nuclear, uranium. Grid construction, transmission, electrical components, cooling, power conversion, aluminum, and copper. These are the physical rails underneath the AI economy. If you only look at software, you miss the rails. If you only look at chips, you miss the energy system that allows the chips to run. If you only look at the broad index, you miss the rotation, and if you only listen to the news, you hear about the change after the money has already started moving. That is the reason this moment matters. It is not that the executive order alone creates the opportunity. It is that the executive order confirms and accelerates a structural shift that was already visible in the data. Smart investors were not waiting for the announcement. They were watching the flows. The public often thinks investing is about prediction. I think the better word is preparation. You study the system in advance, you build the map, you watch the indicators, then when the capital begins to move, you understand what you are seeing. That is how you avoid being surprised by the obvious. The AI grid problem is becoming obvious. Now, it was less obvious when the first sector movements began. It will be even more obvious after the mainstream spends months explaining it to everyone. The question is whether you use this moment to chase a list or to learn the mechanism. A list can help once. A mechanism can help for the rest of your life. Here is the mechanism again in simple language. When a trend becomes too large for the old infrastructure, the bottleneck becomes the opportunity. When the bottleneck becomes strategic, the government gets involved. When the government gets involved, contracts and backlogs can expand. When contracts and backlogs expand, institutional money can move before the public understands the story. When institutional money moves, relative strength appears. When relative strength appears before the narrative is fully mainstream, that is where serious investors begin to pay attention. That is the lesson, not hype, not politics, not excitement. A process. The danger for the average investor is that they will hear this story and immediately ask for the one stock that can make them rich. That is the wrong question. The right question is how to build a watch list, how to compare companies, how to measure backlog quality, how to see whether the move has already become overheated, how to scale into a position, how to manage risk, and how to rotate when the evidence changes. That is what separates investing from gambling. Gambling is wanting the payoff without the process. Investing is accepting the process before the payoff. If you understand that, then this power grid story becomes more than a trade. It becomes an example of how capital moves through the economy. First, the digital economy creates demand. Then, physical infrastructure becomes constrained. Then, policy responds. Then, contracts flow. Then, suppliers benefit. Then, the market reprices the suppliers. That pattern will repeat in other areas. It repeats in energy, defense, healthcare, semiconductors, commodities, cybersecurity, and financial infrastructure. The names change. The mechanism does not. That is why I care more about the framework than the headline. In every cycle, there are people who wait for certainty and then complain that the opportunity is gone. There are people who chase early and get crushed because the idea was right, but the timing was wrong. And there are people who build a disciplined process. Watch the flows and move when evidence becomes strong enough. Try to be in the third group right now. The evidence says the AI power bottleneck is real. It says the grid is old. It says data centers need more energy. It says some companies have already been receiving capital flows. It says government policy is now reinforcing the direction. It says the opportunity is not simply in AI companies, but in the infrastructure that allows AI to exist. That does not mean you should buy blindly. It means you should pay attention intelligently. The world is moving into a period where electricity is no longer just a utility bill. It is becoming a strategic input to intelligence, defense, productivity, automation, and national power. The countries that can produce and move reliable electricity will have an advantage. The companies that can help them do it may become much more important than most investors currently understand. And that is the real message. Do not just watch the dazzling part of the boom. Watch the part that makes the boom possible. Do not just watch the chip. Watch the power behind the chip. Do not just watch the data center. Watch the grid. The generators, the cooling systems, the switchgear, the fuel, the conductors, the contractors, and the backlog. Because the market often rewards the people who understand the infrastructure beneath the story before the story becomes too obvious. This is not about being certain. Certainty is a dangerous illusion in markets. This is about understanding probabilities, incentives, bottlenecks, and flows. The people who do that well are not always the loudest. They are often quietly positioned before the crowd understands why. The opportunity here is not that a politician signed a document. The opportunity is that the document points toward a real pressure already building inside the system. Power demand is rising, the grid is strained, capital is moving, backlogs are growing, and the investors who learn to follow that chain will be much better prepared than the investors who only wait for the next headline. That is the way I would think about it. Not emotionally, not politically, systemically. Because in the end, markets reward people who can see the system before the system becomes obvious to everyone else.